Hello everyone, I am Ian Hamilton and I am an accessibility specialist. So my background before accessibility was in UX and design, and now I work solely in the field of accessibility. So working with people in all different areas of the industry to try and raise the bar for inclusion of people with disabilities in gaming. So that's the topic I've got for you today, and it's a really important topic. It's a field that has advanced enormously in the past couple of years in particular, even to the extent that there are now legislative requirements, legal requirements for accessibility that are going to be hitting on the 1st of January. So if you are a student at the moment, by the time you graduate, this is going to be something that's really, really useful to know about. So what I've got for you is a little bit about why it's important and a few examples of some practical tips that you can implement in your projects. But first, I'm going to start from the beginning and explain a bit about what accessibility actually is. And in order to do that, I'm going to explain a little bit about what disability itself is. And I have this chap here to help me. So this photo was taken from an investigation that this gentleman was doing for The Guardian. And I'm sure that when looking at this picture, most of the people in the room would be able to have some kind of a guess as to what this guy's disability is. So what it actually is that's making him disabled. So you might be guessing that perhaps he has cerebral palsy. In which case, you've guessed correctly in that he does have cerebral palsy. However, cerebral palsy is not actually a disability. That's a medical condition, and that's a really important distinction to make. So what else then? You might be thinking about the fact that he is in a wheelchair. But again, a wheelchair is not a disability. A wheelchair is like a pair of glasses. It's a piece of assistive technology that's actually allowing him to go about his day. And he was going about his day just fine until he went to meet his friends in this bar and encountered the steps. And that's what disability actually is. It's a mismatched interaction. It's when somebody's impairment encounters some kind of a barrier resulting in difficulty performing a day-to-day task. And those barriers, whether it is a flight of stairs, whether it is a shelf that's too high, whether it's the choice of red and green for team colours in a deathmatch, these kind of barriers are often put there by other people, by designers, by developers. And that's kind of a bit of a heavy thing to get your head around. That as designers, as developers, as content producers, we actually contribute towards people's disability. But there is, of course, the flip side to that as well, which is that by being aware of the kinds of barriers that people can face, we can actually avoid or remove them and reduce the amount to which disability affects people's lives. And it's that process that's known as accessibility. Now, accessibility is important for many, many reasons, but I'm just going to concentrate on two. The first one being the human benefit. And I have a little story to help explain that. So what you're looking at on the screen here is something that's called an accessibility switch. And that is a type of technology that's used by people who can't operate traditional input devices. So if you can't use a mouse, you can't use a keyboard, you can't use a controller. They can take all kinds of forms. It might be a big button like this, it might be a button on your wheelchair headrest, it might be a tube to blow into, an infrared blink detector. The thing they all have in common is that it's a simple on-off signal, which is why they're called switches. And it's exactly the same kind of technology that Stephen Hawking used. And the reason I'm showing you this is because we were working on some games for CBeebies at the time. I don't know how many people in the room are big CBeebies watchers, but if you're familiar with a show called Something Special, Mr. Tumble, that's what it was for. So Something Special is aimed primarily at non-verbal autistic preschool children, helping with language development and that kind of stuff. It's also very up on inclusion and representation in general. So the games we were working on to supplement the TV show had to follow the same kind of principles and had to be really, really accessible to a really broad range of players, including players using this kind of technology. So it got to the point where we were going into schools, into kids' homes and testing the games with kids using this kind of tech. And we made a bit of a rookie error because we said that we were looking, in our recruitment profile, said that we were looking for children who have this kind of technology. What we should have said was that we're looking for people who use this kind of technology. Because we actually ended up in one kid's home where the child had this kind of a setup. It was very similar to this. It was like a big flat button they had. They had the technology, but they didn't use it. They didn't use it because they couldn't use it. Because they had really, really profound motor impairment. So even just something as simple as pressing that touchpad was really, really difficult and painful to try and do. They also had really profound learning disabilities. So their parents couldn't actually explain to them why they should have to go through that effort of trying to do that interaction. And the reason why they had gotten this technology was in the hope that someday they would be able to use something like this. This is a communications device. And again, this is kind of like a kid's version, but it's exactly the same way that Stephen Hawking communicated. So you've got a grid of words, a highlight appears on one of the words. Every couple of seconds, the highlight moves onto the next word. So no matter what tiny, tiny kind of interaction you're capable of, when the highlight's on the right word, you make that interaction and it chooses the word. You then choose another word, build up a sentence. Once you build up a sentence, it speaks out through synthesized speech. So this is why they had got this technology for the child in the hope that they'd be able to use something like this, and they might actually be able to have a conversation with their child for the first time. But they couldn't. The motor and the cognitive effort was just too great. So obviously our game that we'd showed up to test with them wasn't going to work. But the parents said, we know that our child likes something special and likes Mr. Tumble. We see their reactions watching the TV show. So as you're here, you may as well just put the game on the screen. They might get something from the experience, even though they can't play it. So, as we were there, we did. So I'll just get out of the way. So what happened was the father put the son on his lap, and there's a prop. Here we go. So they had kind of the big touchpad on the table. The father put the child's hand on top of the touchpad, the father's hand on top, and just played the game for them. But then, as the game went on, he said, look at that, and the child was just starting to stretch out their fingers in an attempt to press the button. And the child had never done anything like that before, ever. And that was going to have a profound effect on the lives of that child and that family. Not just being able to have a conversation with each other for the first time, but all the kind of stuff that's happening now with like smart devices and homes and stuff. There's amazing, amazing stuff you can do with this kind of technology now. So it's going to allow that child to have a much more meaningful and empowered existence. And the reason why this worked, where nothing else had, was because it was a game. Because of that engagement that we all know and understand from playing games, there was no longer any need to explain to this child why they should have to go through this effort. They just really wanted to play with Mr. Tumble on the screen. So it's no exaggeration at all to say that games can really, really profoundly change people's lives. And it doesn't have to be this kind of niche specific stuff either. Literally any game at all has got that power. Any of your games. And it's because what games offer is access to recreation, to culture, to socialising, which is stuff that so many of us take for granted. But if for any reason your means of accessing those things in day-to-day life is somehow restricted, then all of a sudden games, any games, can become a really powerful contributor to your quality of life. So that's one reason why accessibility is important. Another one is a bit more mercenary. And it's that people with disabilities are a market, and not a small market either. If you look at official government data, it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population have some kind of disability. Not everyone within that group is going to encounter barriers in games, but that's more than outweighed by the other conditions that aren't measured within those government figures. So you have things like colorblindness, which affects 8% of males. Difficulty reading. This is the really shocking one, because people don't talk about difficulty reading. There's such a stigma about it. But that actually affects 14% of adults in the UK. So 14% of adults in the UK have the lowest level of literacy and below basic, which is the equivalent of like primary school or lower. Enough that has a big impact on playing games. So whichever way you look at it, there's big numbers involved, and big numbers equates to a lot of money that can be made, and also a lot of money that can be lost by not catering for those audiences. Money left on the table. And that's what this game is an example of. So obviously this is Candy Crush, and what you're currently looking at is a textbook example of how you should design for colourblindness. So you can see you've got all these different candies separated by a difference in colour. They are also separated by a difference in shape or a difference in pattern. So no matter what kind of colour perception you've got, you can always tell them apart. And then the bombs are introduced. So as you can see, they are now separated by colour alone. And what I'm going to show you next is a simulation of what this looks like with one of the most common forms of colour blindness. So I'd like you to just keep an eye on the green, the orange and the red. So that's it, game over. And to put this in context, when this kind of stuff was going on, Candy Crush was pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars per quarter. So that is just, when you think about 8% of males being colourblind, that's potentially huge amounts of money just left on the table through a really trivial design decision. And it's becoming increasingly important as well with games like Candy Crush, with these kind of free-to-play and retention-based business models becoming more prevalent in the industry. You're really, really reliant on keeping people playing for a long time. It's not a case that someone who's spent money in a box product, can't play it, tough, you've already spent the money. You need to keep those people playing and need to keep them spending money. So you really need to avoid stuff like this happening. So it affects lots of people, but not just in terms of people with the permanent physical impairments. What you find is that if you design for a niche group like this, you're also designing for temporary impairments. So you design for someone who's got one hand, you're also designing for someone who's got a broken arm. You're also designing for situational impairments, like holding a baby or holding a beer. Common use case, right? You're also designing for differences in preference as well. So this is an example from Uncharted 4. Uncharted 4 put in some nice stuff on this specific feature, actually. So they have assists on here. One is the camera assist. That just automatically moves the camera on for you. There's also lock on aim. If you turn that on, it makes the aiming work like it does in Grand Theft Auto. So you just point roughly in the right direction, hit lock on, and it aims for you. So if you turn both those assists on, it can then be played using a single hand. You no longer need the other stick at all. As an example of preferences, I think this was someone actually at PlayStation was talking about this, who was talking about different circumstances that he plays the game in. On the weekends, when he's got like a few hours to spare and really wants to enjoy a big challenge, he'll turn all the assists off. If he's playing it on a Wednesday afternoon after a long day's work, he's got half an hour before dinner and he just wants to relax and have some fun, he'll turn the assists on. So because of these kind of things, because of that preference, because of that situational impairment, because of that temporary impairment, there's just under 1% of the population who have one hand. These assists were actually used by a third of Uncharted 4's players. So literally millions of players who are benefiting from this kind of thing. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. You often come across the kind of misconception that this is really niche stuff that only affects small numbers. By the time you take into account that 15-20%, the temporary impairments, the situational impairments, the difference in preferences, it really, really affects huge amounts of players. So that's all well and good. What do you do about it? It can be quite intimidating to start thinking about accessibility. It's often the kind of picture that pops into people's heads. Because it's hard enough trying to design a game that you like, let alone trying to cater for casual versus core. Where would you even start with trying to design for something like this? Well, the good news is you don't have to, because if you think back to the guy at the wheelchair at the start, this is a list of medical conditions. It's not what's important. What's important is the barriers that people encounter. So if you look at two wildly different medical conditions, or let's say cerebral palsy, dyspraxia, essential tremor, those are medical conditions that have nothing in common medically, but they all come up against the same barrier of small fiddly interface elements. So you address that one barrier of small fiddly interface elements, you've actually addressed all these different medical conditions. You've also addressed a whole bunch of conditions relating to vision as well. So once you start to group things together in terms of thinking about barriers, there's only really a few broad groups, which is barriers relating to people's ability to see, people's ability to hear, cognitive, which is your ability to take in, process and action information, and motor, which in most cases in games is your ability to manipulate a controller. There's also speech as well. Speech doesn't crop up too much. Where it really crops up is if you are doing online gaming, so communication online. That's what I consider that. And when looking at your game and considering these kind of barriers, you'll come across some that are necessary, that are just a required part of what makes the game fun. That's totally fine. That's a big difference between accessibility in games and accessibility in other industries, is that games have to be, to some degree, inaccessible. If they weren't to some degree inaccessible, they wouldn't have any kind of barriers, they wouldn't have any challenge. What they would be is a toy or an interactive narrative. So it's okay to have some degree of inaccessibility. What you need to do is work out which of those barriers are unnecessary, which are actually getting in between the vision you want your players to experience and the players' abilities. And once you've identified those unnecessary barriers, the vast majority of them can be solved using two basic principles. And this is them. So, number one, communicate information in more than one way. We've already seen an example of that with Candy Crush. So as well as colour, using shape, using pattern. Another example would be subtitles. So you're using text as well as sound. Then the second one, allowing players some flexibility. So that can mean, well, it basically just means options. Allowing people to tailor the experience to fit their own needs. So that could be a choice of difficulty levels. It could be a choice of controls, a choice of game speed. Now, this is only a short talk, so I can't give you an exhaustive list of every possible solution that you can possibly implement in the game, but I am going to give you a link which will cover that kind of stuff. For now, I'm just going to give you a few key examples. I'm going to give you 4 examples, and these are the top 4 most complained about issues in games. So I have to give a bit of a caveat, and that doesn't mean, like the 4 most complained about, doesn't mean the 4 biggest, because like I said, difficulty reading, people don't complain about that. There's too much of a stigma. But even if these 4 at least give you a starting point, they're relatively straightforward, and even if you only address these 4, it will make a huge difference to your game and make it much more enjoyable for much more people. So the first relates to vision. Nss Colorblindness. So again, I already covered a little bit on colorblindness, talking about Candy Crush, and this is what the first port of call should always be with colorblindness is, try to avoid relying on colour alone to communicate or differentiate. So again, perfect example of how to do this. This is just part of the design by default. Another example of something similar, is anyone familiar with this game? Hue? Yep, cool, okay, a couple of people. So this is a colour-based puzzle platformer. So you have your colour wheel, you choose a colour from the wheel, and that changes the background of the game. So if you were, for example, to change the background of the game to green, that green object would disappear. So you can see how they build up puzzles and stuff through that mechanic. And you can see what they've done here. They've added a symbol language. So this is an optional toggle. You can turn this on and off. But it's the same basic principle as Candy Crush. You're not relying colour alone. You're adding something else into it. And actually this feature is used by a lot of people who weren't colourblind, who just enjoyed having that extra bit of reinforcement. It's not always possible to avoid relying on colour. A common example is if you've got teams in a deathmatch where it might not be financially viable for you to completely do different designs for each team. This is the solution that colourblind gamers ask for so much, but they really rarely get it, which is just letting people choose. Let people choose what colours work best for them. So again, very rarely seen, but if you get the chance to do that, it's highly appreciated. What you more often see is something like this from Destiny. So this is where a few different preset combinations of colours have been designed specifically for common types of colour blindness. This kind of approach involves a bit more knowledge and awareness on the designer side. To get that, there's a piece of software called Colour Oracle that I recommend. This is a colour blindness simulator. So that just sits in your system tray. You hit it and it will put a filter on the colours on your screen to give you an idea of what it looks like with common forms of colour blindness. So that's kind of the approach they used for Destiny, to come up with these preset colour combinations, which is great for people with these three conditions, but there's also all kinds of lesser known edge cases. There's a very small number of people who actually see in black and white. There's also people, for example, who have become colourblind through head injury, and that can have all kinds of unpredictable, unique effects, like swapping colour ranges around completely, things that you can't really design for. So if you can do this kind of approach of letting people choose what other colours they want, you don't need to know about these kind of things. You can let people adapt it to their own needs. Or better still, you can combine the two. Preset, 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 and then custom underneath, let people choose themselves. So that is colour blindness. This is the next issue, which I'm sure a few people in the room have encountered themselves, which is text size. Text size is complained about so much, and it's becoming more and more of an issue as time goes on. So, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So these are all console games designed to be played, well, actually not designed, intended to be played across the room. I won't say designed to be played because often they're designed by someone on the screen like this, sat this close to it, thinking the text looks fine here. Which actually, that text is quite readable here, not so much when it's Another example. So you can see there where it says tram console. Everyone can see where it says tram console, right? This is your primary objective. This is the most important bit of information on the screen. I'm a big fan of Mass Effect games. I played the first 3 games religiously, absolutely loved them. Maybe not like the ending of the 3rd game, but that's another issue entirely. But I got the demo of Mass Effect Andromeda, and that's as far as I got. I never bought the game. My vision is fine, but just you often get people thinking that reducing the text size makes the game a more immersive experience. There's nothing that breaks immersion more than having to get up off your couch and walk over the TV to try and understand what the text is. So, tiny text, really, really common complaint, and not rocket science to fix either. And it's actually a nice example of the fact that the games industry is actually behind other industries being helpful, because it means that you can look at other industries and see the solutions they've already developed and steal them for games. So, standards. So, like, this minimum text size, that comes from guidelines for 10-foot experiences for Google and from Amazon. You also get the same kind of figure if you reverse engineer the Snellen chart, which is the chart you get when you're doing an eye test, for decreasing size letters. Reverse engineer it basically tells you what size text you should be able to see at certain distances. Also, there's very well researched guidelines on what sizes the text on street signs should be. And they're all based on like a viewing angle. If you work it out based on 1080p at an average size screen, average size viewing distance, it comes out around there. Stuff like subtitles, they need to be a bit bigger because smaller text is more difficult to take in at speed. So this is what to aim for at a minimum, but you can allow it to be configurable as well. That's something that's common in other industries, but not so much in games. There's a few games that are starting to have scalable UI on consoles and mobile. It's more common than PC, but it'd be something that'd be nice to see more of. So this is what it looks like on the screen. That's the kind of thing you should be aiming for. So next up, hearing. When you think about accessibility for people who have difficulty hearing, the first thing that usually pops into people's heads is subtitles. And subtitles are present in pretty much all games. Not so much in VR, but again, that's a different topic for another day. But subtitles are used for many, many reasons. I'm sure there's plenty of people in the room who don't have any kind of hearing loss. I use subtitles. People use subtitles perhaps if English isn't your first language. Perhaps because games have unpredictable audio mixes. You never know when there's going to be a big explosion going off halfway through an important bit of exposition. Because you've got a cheap TV. Because you have kids running around shouting when you're trying to play. Because you have a baby. The only chance you get to play is when the baby's asleep, so you have to play on mute. And there's all kinds of reasons why people use subtitles. And we rely on subtitles to have a good time in the game. So obviously, that justifies putting some good design work in and doing a good job of subtitles. But nobody does. Nobody. They are terrible across the entire industry. And I do mean in all of your games as well. And this isn't me saying this, this is from the players. So this is just a little taster from a single page of a NeoGAF thread. If you are a glutton for punishment, check out the URL at the top, there's plenty more. But you get the idea, right? So gamers generally aren't very happy about the state of subtitles in games. And you can start to get the picture here. The kind of things that people are complaining about really are not rocket science at all. There's two things above all else that people complain about. First one, yes, a few people in the room are saying size, there we go. There's no Photoshop involved in this, this is an actual screenshot. So that's the first thing, size. The second thing, contrast. So you can see here where the white text is going against the light background. Bear in mind this is Assassin's Creed Black Flag. The previous game, Assassin's Creed 3, was largely set in the snow. But like I said, it's not rocket science to figure. So actually, a bit of irony here. This white text here has got a nice dark background behind it. So this is the kind of thing that you should be aiming for as a minimum. So this is from a mobile game called something. Bertram Fiddle, that's it, Bertram Fiddle. So this is the kind of thing you should be aiming for as a minimum. So you can see there's like a nice, easy to read font. It's really clearly separated from the background. It's a decent size. And I say as a minimum because there's different use cases for subtitles. Different people use them for different reasons. So you've got some people who are completely deaf, 100% reliant on subtitles. They must clearly understand every single word. They need to be as clear and easy to read as possible. The other end of the scale, you've got people who just have them turned on in case they occasionally miss a word and need to refer to them. The rest of the time they want them to be as unobtrusive as possible. So actually, each one of these three options is the preferred option for a certain group of people. So if you've got these competing preferences, which one do you go for? As it's a digital medium, you don't have to. You can let people choose themselves, let people configure them. And this is something that is standard in other industries, even required by law in other industries. So in the USA, there's actually legislation that requires broadcast video to have configurable subtitle presentation. So if you open up YouTube, you open up Netflix, open up the settings, you've got a standardized customization menu that lets you change the size, lets you change the transparency of the background box, all that kind of stuff. It's starting to happen now in games. So this is an example. This is Assassin's Creed Origins. So you can see they've just started to do a couple of things like that. You have a toggle here that allows you to turn the speaker name off. So like the top two, where it says Bertram, you can turn that Bertram on and off in Assassin's Creed Origins. The other one, subtitle background. So that black box behind that's used for extra contrast. Some people absolutely rely on that, other people find it really intrusive, so really, really important to give people the option. And how difficult is that to turn that option, to provide that option? I'm going to give you a list now. I'm going to give you a list of all of the games that I'm aware of that have offered that option to turn that black box on and off. Assassin's Creed Origins and Life is Strange. That's the list. So if you want to be at the pinnacle of innovation in the games industry, let people turn that black box on and off. That's what it takes.
Another interesting accessibility feature on this particular screenshot is that they communicate whether an option is on and off or part of a list through iconography as well.
Yep. Yeah, and you find out with colorblindness especially. So something like Candy Crush, the fact that you are providing that symbol as well as the colour is just extra reinforcement for all players. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you can do for subtitles. I'm not going to run through this list now. If you do want to really ace your subtitles in the game, check out the URL at the top, and that'll give you lots of good guidance. But if you just do those two things, if you just make sure your subtitles have decent size, decent contrast, it'll mean that many, many more people can have an enjoyable experience with your game. So, last one now, motor. So this consideration that I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to use another person here to help me explain what it is. And this chap here, he had a stroke at the age of 17, which meant that he lost all control of the right-hand side of his body. But he wasn't interested in giving up gaming. Why would you, right? And he still plays just fine using a regular controller. And how he does that is, if you look a bit closer, basically he takes the controller and he wedges it underneath his right arm that he can't use, but by moving his left hand around, he pushes the stick against his arm and can then control the right stick. He then uses his left thumb to move the left joystick around. That then allows him a couple of fingers free to press buttons with. So he can actually play pretty well. He does have a restriction though on which buttons he can simultaneously reach at the same time, just with his one hand. So what he really needs is if there was some way to rearrange the controller and move the most important actions for that game to locations that were easiest for him to reach. So what he needs is button remapping. So again, this is something that's really, really useful for tons of players, just like because you disagree with the interesting creative choices the designer's taken with the controls. But for some people, this feature is make or break. That's literally the difference between whether you can play or not. And remapping is something that actually has started to be implemented at system level. So both the Xbox and the PlayStation allow the controls to be remapped at system level. That's only intended as a safety net. It's not a substitute. It's always, always better to do it in the games. If you do it in games, it allows you to, for example, have different maps for driving and for walking, different maps for different characters, like in Overwatch allows you to have different remapping for each different class. Allows you to remap, adjust the controls and leave the menus the same. It allows you to update the in-game prompts for the controls according to the new mapping. Even just basic usability, because most of the people who use remapping aren't necessarily people who would consider themselves to have accessibility needs and wouldn't necessarily think to look at the system menu of a console to change the controls, right? So it's always, always better. So don't take it from me though. This is a quote by the person who actually designs the remapping functionality on the Xbox. So again, I just want to drive that home. So the system level stuff is only a safety net. Always, always implement it at game level if you can. And if... Where did that we come from? Okay, ignore the word we. Okay, so alright, typos aside. Yeah, very important. If you are using something like Unity, there's plugins and stuff you can use to handle this kind of stuff for you. Stuff like in control and things like that. So it's really quite easy to do as well. So that's all the examples. Hopefully that has given you a little bit of a taste of But this kind of stuff really isn't rocket science, and it isn't niche either. A lot of this stuff is just good basic game design that benefits all players. And I did say I was going to give you a link with an exhaustive resource, and that is this one. This is gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. So if you check that out, it's the same kind of stuff I've been showing you. Lots of examples of barriers and examples of solutions to those barriers. So I'm going to finish now, but I've got one last little thing for you, which is going to be some audience participation, because I know that's everybody's favourite part of every talk is the audience participation. But I promise it won't be too painful. So I talked at the beginning a bit about some of the reasons why accessibility is important. This is kind of related to that. So I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here, and I'm going to assume that most of the people in the room currently play games. And I'm going to ask you for a show of hands. So I'd like you to put up your hand if you are planning on giving up playing games once you reach the age of 65. No takers. I told you it wasn't going to be painful. So the reason I'm asking you that is because at the start I was talking about like that 15%, that 20%. Once you're over the age of 65, that's actually 50%. So there's a good chance it's going to come to you. And that's another really, really important reason to think about accessibility, a selfish reason, which is that we really need to be tackling accessibility now, solving these problems, putting these good practices into place today, so that all of us continue to learn as we go. Exactly. Thanks.
If anybody does have just a couple of questions, I think we can go with that.
Yep, and if you do run out of time, my contact details, hit me up anytime and I will gladly talk your ear off and overrun on social media as well.
Siobhan, you've got your hand up at the back.
Yeah, sorry to raise up some questions. What screen reader should I use with the universal accessibility plugin on Mac and PC?
So the question's about screen readers, which is text-to-speech software that blind gamers use. What stuff to test with if you're developing blind accessible stuff, right? So if PC, use NVDA, which is nvaccess.org. And for Mac, just use the built-in system one, VoiceOver.
Nothing for mobile, right?
So on mobile, yeah, same, use the built-in system one. So TalkBack for Android and VoiceOver for iOS.
Okay.
And I've just got a random question about retro games actually. How active is development of alternate controllers for older game systems at the moment? Is that something that gets touched on at all? Because I know we used to have things like the ASCII grip on the Super NES for playing RPGs with one hand and things like that. But is anyone developing solutions for people who want
There was stuff developed back in the day.
Yeah.
So this is about custom controllers on older devices.
Yeah.
It used to be much easier because it was before the big corporates got involved and decided to lock things down. But yeah, everything. When it was back in the days of the old 8-pin plugs, you could hack about and do anything you want. There was loads of really cool stuff back then. Has anyone in the room come across someone called OneSwitch on Twitter?
No.
Yeah, look up someone called OneSwitch. He is an accessibility historian. And actually, we ran a game accessibility conference a couple of weeks ago, and he did a talk just on the accessibility of, the history of game accessibility. And there's loads of really, really cool examples of stuff for older consoles, including one that we actually had on display, which was the Nintendo hands-free controller. And that was actually a device that came out in, I think, the late 80s. And this was like a boxed product that Nintendo sold. It'd be nice to see them do stuff like this again. So basically, you put this thing around your neck. It kind of made you look like Darth Vader with a big chest. It had a stick coming out with a cup on it, and you could control that with your chin. And this was for the NES, so the only controls you had was up, down, left, right, A and B. So you used your chin to do up, down, left, right. It also had a tube. You blow into the tube for A, suck into the tube for B. And this was like an actual boxed product that Nintendo brought out.
There's a Twitch streamer called Colorblind, and he actually streams Overwatch while using the colorblind methods they had. You were talking about the colorblind like settings to try and change the visuals. Is there something like pre-made could just do that for you, or would you have to kind of redo the colouring assets for it? Like, is there?
So that's Colorblind with a K, right? The person you're talking about, the streamer?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's put out quite a lot of videos protesting quite loudly about the approach that was taken with Overwatch. So filters, so this is basically the only way you can do it kind of out of the box is by using filters. Filters aren't great. Filters have that same restriction that they only work for the specific groups you've designed for. They also shift entire ranges of colour. So like if you shift all the greens towards blue, you then end up with bluegrass. So like it affects other things that weren't intended to as well. It can also introduce new clashes as well. So that same example, if you shift all the greens towards blue, that then makes green and blue hard to distinguish. So it has some issues. There are circumstances where that is the right solution to use. Like for example, in Madden 17, they introduced colorblind modes through filters, and that was because they had licensing restrictions. They weren't actually allowed by NFL to make changes to the kit colours, so it had to be through an external method that they did it. So that kind of thing is possible. I would say probably using filters is better than nothing. But if you can actually do it through design, especially if you can do it through not relying on colour alone, so you just remove it from the equation and don't need any kind of modes at all, then that's the first protocol.